Okay, I am adding this podcast based on another McKinsey report called McKinsey Sustainability, which focuses on 9 key sectors and makes some uh, estimates about decarbonizing. So, decarbonizing the world's industries, a net zero guide for 9 key sectors. We've looked at this in several ways, but I want to keep adding just in case there are some things that appeal to you, and then you can follow up. So the sectors that produce the majority of global greenhouse gas emissions face a steep challenge to decarbonize, but our research shows that solutions are within reach. So this is an optimistic point, which I always like. In many cases, a transformation is well underway. That's even better. This collection draws together articles and reports that lay out a pathway to net zero for 9 emissions-intensive industries. So I'll show the 9 sectors, and in each sector in the report there are related articles under read more about this sector, which I'm not including, but you can follow up. So let's start with power. What's the momentum? Over the past decade, the costs of renewables have dropped substantially, which I have looked at in other contexts. Solar power by as much as 80% and wind power by about 40%. There are issues still about recycling and so on, and actually what fraction of the total energy they make up. Especially the Russian invasion of Ukraine has exposed many of the issues with power, especially in Europe. So these make them economically competitive with conventional fuels such as coal and natural gas, but coal and natural gas have subsidies, and so do solar and oils, so do solar and wind, so we have to be careful about what is being compared. The acceleration, a successful transition to net zero will require meeting increased demand for electricity by scaling up renewable low carbon power generation and building enough flexibility in power systems to match supply and demand. So that's where the acceleration could come from. By 2035, more than 50% of global power generation can be from renewables. 50%, is that enough? Well, we have to think of fossil fuels as a way to transition as quickly as possible. So in combination with other things that we will look at in other sectors, 50% by 2035 in terms of renewable energy contribution could be great. So here, gas, nuclear, and oil by 35% share, 53% renewable, solar, onshore wind, hydro, offshore, and other, which could include nuclear and so on. Plus, if there's any miraculous advance in fusion, that could change the game altogether. Oil and gas, where's the momentum? Several gas and oil companies have set net zero emissions targets for their operations. Some are already reducing and offsetting their emissions, while others are divesting from high carbon portfolios and investing in new technologies and businesses such as hydrogen. There's a lot of pressure from shareholders themselves in some cases, which is accelerating this process. So the acceleration, oil and gas companies have capabilities that may be valuable for parts of a low carbon energy system, such as access to capital and operational expertise. So how to reorient their expertise and capital to low carbon economies. Leaders can look to frame strategic choices around managing carbon, rebalancing portfolios, and playing to core strengths. So here, a 10% increase in oil and gas production efficiency, just not reducing production but continuing production but increasing 10% in efficiency, can deliver a 4% reduction in emissions intensity. So an increase in oil and gas production efficiency of 10% can deliver a reduction in emissions intensity of 4%. So these estimates are based on Net Zero 2050 scenario from Network for Greening the Finance System and GFS that we have talked about in another podcast, which has an even chance of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C, a hypothetical scenario, not a prediction or a projection. What's the next one? Automotive. Here, the momentum is that sales and planned production of low emissions cars have surged. By 2035, we project that a new passenger vehicle sales in the largest automotive markets, China, the EU, and the United States, will be close to 100% electric. So, passenger vehicle sales in the largest automotive markets will be close to 100% by 2035. Acceleration. To make low emissions vehicles the new norm, new supply chains and manufacturing capabilities are needed, as well as corresponding infrastructure such as charging stations and hydrogen fueling stations. Innovations in electrifying heavy vehicles and trucks and developing autonomous vehicles could also help. So things like highways over which you drive and the battery gets charged along the way, etc. Virtually all new car sales will be electric vehicles by 2050. So here is the projection, estimates based on net zero 2050 scenario from NGFS. So by 2020 and 2050, ICEs are still very much around, and 47% electric vehicles by 2030. You can see phasing out of ICEs by 2050. Battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles could reach 100% by 2050. Aviation and shipping, which has the largest irreducible carbon now, has a momentum. The two sectors share similar solutions, modernizing fleets and increasing the use of sustainable fuels. Airlines, for example, are developing hybrid electric, battery electric, and hydrogen fuel cell electric options for short-haul flights. For shipping, zero-emissions fuel technologies are available but need to be scaled up, and costs need to come down, of course. The acceleration is going to come from sustainable aviation fuels, which can be produced from forestry waste and other forms of biomass, and they have the potential to reduce net emissions by as much as 70 to 100% versus fossil fuels. One way to accelerate shipping decarbonization is to implement green corridor trade routes between major port hubs where zero emission solutions are supported. So more than 17% of global commercial aviation CO2 emissions could be addressed with lower carbon technologies. So is that a big number? Well, it adds up along with the other sectors, and this sector remains the most stubborn in terms of decarbonizing. So 17% reduction in aviation industry CO2 expected. Okay, steel and cement, again, big ticket items for emissions. Many major steel makers have pledged to go carbon neutral as demand for green steel is spiking. Some solutions, such as steel produced in mills powered by green hydrogen, could scale up and become cost effective within the next decade. There are other things like arc furnaces and so on that we have discussed elsewhere, and of course reducing emissions from mining operations. But just focusing on steel, a successful transition to net zero will require large scale investments in technologies, operational advances, new input materials, and a shift to renewable power sources. So demand for low emission steel could rise to almost all production by 2050. So steel production by emission in billion metric tons, in 2020 1.8 billion, so about 15% is low emission. By 2050 the total emission could go up to 2 billion metric tons, but of that low emissions could be 90% of the steel that is produced. Okay, cement, here we go. Some cement companies have used advanced analytics and other operational tactics to optimize for energy efficiency, while others have experimented with emissions reducing production methods. Going forward, industry could explore alternative energy sources such as biomass, carbon capture, and digitization of manufacturing for the acceleration. The cement industry could reduce emissions by up to 75% by 2050 with alternative fuels, new technologies, and other measures. Okay, so CO2 emissions reductions, gigatons annually from 2017 to 2050 could go from 2.7 to 0.7, a 75% reduction, which would be pretty amazing. Mining. The momentum is that raw materials will be at the center of decarbonization efforts. Copper for electrification, lithium and cobalt for batteries, for example. Mining companies will be expected to grow faster and more cleanly than ever before. The acceleration would come from the availability of certain raw materials will need to be scaled up within a relatively short time, in certain cases at volumes 10 times or more than the current market size, to prevent shortages and keep new technology costs competitive. Sustainable fuels and green electricity, among other solutions, could help decarbonize operations. Decarbonization of haulage trucks could reduce a mine's emission by 25%. Okay, so CO2 output reduction, 25%, that is possible to come just from decarbonizing the haulage trucks. Agriculture and food, another sector that constantly requires attention, especially with a growing population, increasing food, especially if biofuels also begin to demand more grains production. Promising technologies in animal feeding, soil carbon sequestration and crop fertilization are in development or already in use. The market for cultivated meats, those grown in bioreactors from animal cells, could become a 25 billion global industry by 2030. The acceleration, uptake of zero emissions farm equipment and machinery, including tractors, harvesters and dryers, is behind that of electric vehicles, but cost reductions and supportive financing could accelerate adoption. Technology to abate agricultural emissions could attract 400 billion to 600 billion in annual investments by 2050. So 400 to 600 billion annual investments in green technologies to slow down agricultural emissions, which would be pretty amazing, because any market-based solutions tend to have better acceleration potential than the subsidized, regulated, top-down kind of solutions trying to be imposed by governments. Okay, forestry and other land use. Forests are natural carbon sinks. They absorb CO2 and release oxygen, obviously. Preventing deforestation has substantial abatement potential. It is cheaper to implement than many other technological or natural climate solutions, and protects people's livelihoods. The acceleration, well-managed reforestation can be used to offset hard-to-abate emissions in sectors such as cement and steel, and it can be done right now. So it's an offset kind of idea. Offset is got a lot of issues, especially reforestation has limited land available, so not everybody can offset, obviously. Forest protection and restoration projects could help generate revenue from sale of carbon credits in carbon markets, but one must keep in mind that industries doing offsetting will demand more and more land, but there is a limited amount of land available for forestation. The market for carbon credits could be worth up to upward of 50 billion in 2030. So there is the carbon market evaluation in billions, 50 billion by 2030. Good news, well, if one thinks of these as parts of the portfolio of decarbonization, and these are just the 9 sectors of industries that can decarbonize with these, and other things have to go forward, renewables and maybe behavioral changes as well, plus hopefully some game changers that come along in carbon capture and sequestration and energy efficiencies, nuclear fusion maybe, and so on, together can still keep us on track for at least staying under 2 degrees C by 2100, if not 1.5 degrees centigrade global warming target. Wow, 1.5 is going to be reached pretty soon with the way we are going, especially after COVID, how economies are chugging along trying to recover from the impacts of COVID. So let's see how this all goes, but I just wanted to include this report here just along with all the other reports we have been looking at. Okay.